Today we're going to learn Eruvin Daf Hey. Today's shiur is sponsored by Sarah Borelowitz in memory of her mother, Kila Bat Yehuda Zichrona Lebracha, on her yurtzeit. She would have been delighted to know that her daughter is learning the daf. With that, we will get started. Today, we're not going to get into any issues of Mizbeach and Mishkan and all that. Okay, so we're getting more into the nitty-gritty of the Eruvin. Just to review, we had a bunch of comparisons to the Mikdash, to the Mishkan, to Sukkah. I think, again, the Gemara is, number one, trying to put things into a context, into a framework of, here we have measurements, and these measurements are the same as we find in other places, and to give it a broader perspective. And we talked about before also giving it a more religious significance of taking something that's mundane, like Eruvin, and carrying on Shabbat, which is very basic, and giving it some sort of level of sanctity. So comparing measurements to the altar, comparing measurements to the Mikdash, I think it gave it, and to the Sukkah, giving it significance. Okay, the Sukkah is almost this in-between, where it's got some sort of, doesn't really have Kedusha to its sanctity, but yet it's used for a mitzvah, and here we're kind of connecting all those ideas. Today we're going to be a little more nitty-gritty into all sorts of details. The pictures, as I mentioned before, are incredibly helpful. What I decided I'm going to do, since now everyone can access the Ma'or HaMevu'al online, you can find it on the portal at Daf Yomi site. You can do a search for Ma'or HaMevu'al, and you can find it there. I passed the link around to some people. If you need it and didn't get it I put it on the WhatsApp group. If you're not there, then ask me. You can write to me and I'll send it to you. But I would use that, and I'm going to reference numbers of pictures in that book, and that will be more helpful in terms of following along inside while we learn. And I'll try to show them on the YouTube. So if you don't have it and you want to look at the YouTube, you can watch. But it's not as easy to see the pictures through that. Okay, today we have a lot of pictures that'll be very helpful to see. Somebody actually written, there's this other book called the Perush Chai, which also you can find online. It's more black and white pictures, not three-dimensional. Someone actually wrote, and it seems to me like a lot of the pictures from the Ma'or HaMevu'al were taken from his pictures that he did. This is a book written, I think, 35 years ago. And, they kind of adapted his pictures and made them look nicer, three-dimensional, etc. Okay, his pictures are also incredibly helpful, and you can find them online also, the Perush Chai for Eruvin. I also sent the link around if you want any of the links. Plus, there's this new book, Kol HaLashon, just to review also, that you can find that online on Kol HaLashon's website. So these are all helpful books, but I'll try to just make references according to the numbers in the Ma'or HaMevu'al. Starting from 6 lines from the bottom of Dalet Amud Bet. If you remember, the first question we asked in the Gemara was, why does the Mishnah say it describes the takana, how you can fix it, whereas by Sukkah it doesn't say how to fix it. Here it says very simply, if your mavoi is taller than 20 amma and your beam at the top is higher than 20 amma off the ground, 20 cubits, then yima'et, we lower it. Now there's 2 ways to do that. Either you make the beam thicker, you make it lower down, or you raise the floor. That's another way to do it. So now they say, well, if you want to, you want to make it less distance between the floor and the ceiling, however you do that, right, in the height of the beam. So they say, kama mima'ato, kama mima'et. How much do you have to, lessen that amount? That's a ridiculous question, and the Gemara says that. Kama mima'et, kama ditzarichle. It all depends how high it is. If it's 5 amot too tall, well, then lower it by 5 amot, or raise the ground by 5 amot. That can't be the question. That's quite obvious. So they say, it must be a different question. Ella, whatever it needs. Ella, what's the question? Ruchbo bekama. How much space into the mavoi do you need to go to raise the floor or lower the ceiling or the beam? In other words, the beam, we already said, is 1 tefach of width. But possibly now we're going to see that maybe it's not enough. Okay, and the assumption. Okay, and let's look at our first picture. If you look at picture number 15. Okay, so here we have someone standing at the entranceway to the mavoi, and there's a big beam on the ground. Okay, that raises up the ground so that you don't have 20 amma between you and the beam. So now we say, how far into the mavoi does that need to go? What's the width of that beam? Obviously, it's going to go across, just like the beam goes across the length. This, and it's called an itztaba in Hebrew. This itztaba that we have, this step that you put in kind of thing, it's obviously going to be the length, or again, it's width or length, but the length of the beam is going to go across the opening of the alley. But the question is, how wide is it? How much does it go into the mavoi? So we're going to have a machloket, Rav Yosef and Abaye, and then we're going to have 4 ways to understand the debate between them. Rav Yosef amar tefach, Abaye amar arba'ah. Rav Yosef said 1 handbreadth width, and Abaye says 4. Okay, now 1 would match the beam on top, that's 1. 4 all of a sudden is something else. Now, one assumption we're going to make is that generally things have to fit into, as I said before, things fit into a broader context of measurements. So before we had, similar to measurements of sukkah, similar to measurements of, mechitza in general. We learned that from the Aron, different things like that. But now we're going to say that once it's not a tefach, the next measurement up is 4 tefachim. That's generally the next significant measure. So it's probably why he jumped from 1 to 4. Okay, but 4 in and of itself doesn't necessarily seem so significant, but it's probably because that's the next measurement. So if 1's not going to be enough, we're going to jump to 4. So now we're going to say why. Lema b'haka miflage. Let's suggest that this is the machloka between them. Demanda amar tefach, the one who says tefach, kasavar mutar lishtamesh tachar hakora. They're going to say that there's a debate about whether the space where the mavoi, where the beam is, the entranceway to the alley, is that space considered reshut harabim, or is it considered the mavoi? Right? And that would explain, can you carry, this is anytime you have a doorway. Is the doorway, we saw this before in Shabbat once, is the doorway considered outside, or is the doorway considered inside? So if you say the doorway is considered inside as part of the mavoi, then it's enough that you raise the floor specifically right there in that area, and then you have this space within the mavoi that's less than 20 amma, and that's good. But manda amar arba'ah, but Abaye, who says it needs 4 tefachim, kasavar asur l'shtamesh tachar hakora. You can't use that space, meaning that space where the beam is and underneath it is all considered the public domain. If it's considered the public domain, then when I'm standing in my mavoi, that there's more than 20 amot between me and the beam that's up on top there. And therefore, it has to be in the mavoi, if I want to say, because again, if it's going to be noticeable or something like that, or even if a mechitza is going to function, it's going to function as a mechitza, it has to be less than 20 amma. And since the only place where it's less than 20 amma is outside already in the public domain, because that space of the doorway is considered the public domain, then that's not going to work. If the whole floor, or at least let's say, well, he's going to say if there's 4 tefachim worth of space where your floor is raised, even though the rest of the mavoi not, but in that 4 tefachim's worth of space, the floor is raised, and then you can see the korah because it's less than 20 amma away from you, then that will work. And therefore, he thinks you need 4 tefachim, so that, theoretically, it really could be 1 tefach. But it jumps up to 4 because it's saying, if it was 2 tefachim, then you could have 1 tefach that's kind of considered public domain, and then the 1 is already in your mavoi. But the assumption is you need a bit more space than just that, and you want it to be jutting into your mavoi space, and therefore we're going to say it needs to be 4 tefachim into the mavoi that the floor is raised. So that's the first option. Then the Gemara says, no, not necessarily. It's not saying no, for sure not, but not necessarily. You could still say, everybody thinks that space is part of the mavoi, and then theoretically 1 tefach should be enough. But the root of the debate is something else. Mar saval korah mishum heker, umar saval korah mishum mechitza. I've said this a few times, that throughout the Masechet, we're going to see that a bunch of machlokot split up into, do you view the beam or the korah or the lechi as a heker, as just something noticeable, or do you view it as an actual, I would say, imaginary wall? So that's exactly what this machloket is based on. How so? So one holds it's mishum heker. If it's mishum heker, you just want it to be noticeable. And since the space under the beam is still considered part of the mavoi, at that space, it's going to be noticeable. Since it's noticeable in that space, therefore, it's fine. No problem. 1 tefach wide is sufficient. But if you hold it's mechitza, then you're going to need 4 tefachim. Why is this? So Rashi explains to us that a mechitza, in order for something to be considered a wall, it has to be on a space of 4 tfachim wide. If it's not on a space of 4 tfachim, it's not considered a wall. A wall has to be settled on something of significance. So if you view this from din, just to notice it, so as long as right at the entranceway of the mavoi, and it's part of the mavoi, it's less than 20 amma, that's fine. But if you hold it has to be, it's viewed as a wall, as if it's this imaginary wall, well, the wall, even though it's only imaginary, it has to rest on something. So if the wall can't be more than 20 amma, right now, the assumption is like this. The wall can't land, when we view an imaginary wall, it can only go down 20 amot. It can't go down more than that. And if we view it as if it imaginarily goes down 20 amot, well, then it has to have a space that's within 20 amot where it can rest. So if it's not a 4 tfachim's width of space, then it's not going to be able to kind of land anywhere in an imaginary world. So basically, and he quotes the Gemara that comes up on Daf Pevav, the very end of Rashi, Dibor Matchil, Manda Amar Arba'a Kasavar Korah, he says, De'en mechitzot elen ken yesh toch hachalal arba'a. It has to have a space of 4 tfachim to land on. So if you view it as mechitza, you're going to need 4. So that's the second option of the machloket. V'i bait ema, a third option, Dekule alma korah mishum heker. Maybe they all view it, that the korah, the beam, is just a noticeable element. And we said before that everyone agrees that it's within the mavoi. So now what's your issue? Why would you need 4? What's the issue? We already said for the beam to be noticeable, what does it need? It needs to have a width of a tefach. But the question is, does the heker on the floor, the reminder on the ground, need to be the same as the reminder that we need above? And this is very logical. We'll explain in a minute. Rav Yosef thinks it's the exact same thing. So whatever your beam at the top needs to be, that's what your beam at the bottom needs to be, or whatever it might be that you kind of raise the floor with. That's fine. It's all the same. Tefach, tefach. Umar savar, but Abaye says, Lo amrinan heker shamata ke'heker shamala. Things that are at height are maybe more noticeable than things on the ground. Generally, when you walk on the ground, unless you're going on a tiyul, on a hike, you're not generally looking at the ground, right? When you're going on a hike and there's rocks, so you generally look down. But normally when you walk and you look either straight ahead or you might look upward. So things that are above, if they're a tefach, you'll notice them. But things on the ground, if they're just a tefach, you might not notice them. So it comes Abaye and he says, while it's on the ground, we're going to need it to be more significant. So therefore, again, why do we jump to 4? Well, that's because that's the next measurement that we have. So then he'd say we need to be 4. Last option, I told you there'll be 4 possibilities to understand the machloket. Everybody thinks 1 tefach is sufficient. Again, you're going to have to, right. So again, what does this mean? They obviously don't think 1 tefach is sufficient, but for all the reasons we said so far, this part is considered within the mavui. And it's mishum heker, just as a reminder. And the reminder at the bottom can be the same as the reminder at the top. So why does Abaye need 4 tefachim? Maybe there's a concern. Abaye thinks we're worried that what might happen. Think about another issue. So before I said if things are on the ground, you might not notice them as much because you don't look down. But now we have another thing. If things are on the ground, people step on them. People step on things. What happens? Over time, they wear out. And it might become smaller than a tefach. So right now it might be a tefach, but in a few days or a few weeks or a few months, it's going to wear away from people walking, from the rain, from all sorts of things. And it might end up, right, I guess the rain less so because then the beam will be an issue, but I think more from people walking on it. And therefore, Abaye says we're concerned that it might wear away, and therefore you have to make it larger. And again, jump up to the next level, we'll make it 4 tefachim. So again, 4 different interpretations. If you want to review them, you can look back at the sheet. Moving on. Now we're going to do the same thing. We talked about that's the maximum height of 20 amot. There's also a minimum height of 10 tefachim. 10 handbreadths off the ground is where the height of your beam has to be. Your beam can't be lower than 10 tefachim off the ground. So now the Gemara is going to say, Haya pachot me'asara tefachim v'chakak bo kedei lahashlimo la'asara. Now, if your beam is less than 10 tefachim off the ground, and you want it to be 10 tefachim off the ground, what do? You dig up the ground underneath the mavoi. Okay, again, there's a picture here. This is picture number 16. Okay, so if you look at this picture, I'll try to show you. There's the entrance to the mavoi. I don't think you can see this in the video, but if you look right in the front, there's that brown area. That's where they dig up space. Okay, they dig up space to basically make the beam a height of 10 tefachim. So if you have your height now of 10 tefachim, so now they say if you want to dig to get to 10 tefachim, kama chokek, how much do you have to dig? So again, the Gemara is going to say, what are you talking about? Kama chokek, kama tzarich. All depends what the height of the beam is will affect how deep you have to dig. So they say, oh no, that's not what we meant. We meant the exact same question we had before. Ela moshcho bekama. How far into the mavoi do you have to dig up? Do you have to dig up just one tefach of space? That's now going to make the height a korah, or more than that? How much? So now at this point, we're going to need more than what we needed on the previous. There's still going to be a machloket, but the minimum, whoever holds a less is going to have more than normal. Okay, moshcho bekama, more than the previous one. So Rav Yosef, who said before that when you raise the ground, it only needs to be a tefach off the ground, here he's going to say ba'arba'ah. He needs 4 tefachim. You have to dig 4 tefachim in order to have this, right? So you have to dig 4 tefachim in. Let's say that it was a height of 8, so you dig 2 tefachim down, but a width of 4 tefachim into the mavoi. Again, it's going to cover the whole entranceway to the mavoi, but then how far into the mavoi do you need to go? He says 4 tefachim. Abai amar be'arba amot. Okay, he says you need to go in 4 amot, 4 cubits. That's a lot more. Okay, because remember, each cubit is 5 or 6, right? So 5 or 6 handbreadths. So he's going to go 4 amot into the mavoi. So now the question is, what's the machloket here? And the assumption here is that if your beam is at a height of 10, then we're going to have to say it needs to be a height of 10 for a space that's 10 tefachim tall, okay, basically from the beam. And it's basically going to be like the minimum measure of what an alleyway would be. Okay, so maybe they're debating this issue that Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi said, okay, where they made a statement, and one of them is going to agree with this, and one of them is not going to agree. Itmar. Mavoi shenifratz mitzido klape rosho. Switch to the picture. Picture number 17. Okay, you have a mavoi here. You have an alleyway. Again, an alleyway is made up of 3 walls on one side and 1 open wall. But all the other walls are standing and you just have 1 open space. And we're going to learn that the mavoi has to be longer than it is wide. Okay, that's the shape of a mavoi. It's like an alley, the way you would imagine an alley. The alleyway has an entranceway. You don't enter it on the wide side, you enter it on the narrow side and you go into the alleyway. So now what happened if klape rosho, near the front of the mavoi, on the wall that's attached to where the mavoi is, the entrance to the mavoi and the beam, if that wall has a huge gap in it. Okay, so here, there's a big gap in the wall, but let's read it inside again. So he says, if there's a mavoi shenifratz mitzido on the side, meaning on one of the side walls, klape rosho, near the front of the entrance to the mavoi. Itmar mishmei de Rabbi Ami v'Rabbi Asi, it was said in their name, Im yesham pas arba'a matir b'pirtza ad esra. As long as in the front of the mavoi, you still have a wall standing on the side, meaning wall number, like this, let's say there's walls 1, 2, 3, and 4. So 4 is the open one, 3 is the one next to 4 on one side. If the wall is standing and it's 4 handbreadths wide, the part that's standing before it breaks, if attached to the entrance to this mavoi is a wall that's 4 tefachim wide, or 4 tefachim long, I should say. If it's 4 tefachim long, there's a pas arba'a, matir b'pirtza ad eser. This basically allows, okay, what's going to happen? If there's too big a hole in the wall, we're basically going to say, in order to allow the mavoi, by putting up a lechi or a korah, you have to have walls, 3 walls surrounding it. If a wall is too open, then it's not going to be considered a wall, and therefore we're not going to have the 3 walls. We're only going to have 2 walls and the entrance to the mavoi, and that's not going to work. You can't put up a lechi or korah if you have a huge gap in the wall. So the question is, what kind of gap is okay? So he says, as long as the wall is standing 4 tefachim long at the entranceway, even if it's open up until 10 cubits long, okay, that's pretty far. Even if that's the amount of space where it's open, that still counts, okay? Is matir b'pirtzad eser, as long as it's less than 10 amot of an opening, and you have 4 up against the mavoi entranceway, that works. So what do you see basically? Then a mavoi, right, this is Rav Yosef basically. I'm going to read the end of the statement in a minute, but we already got to the important part of his statement, which is that Rav Yosef would agree with this statement of Rabbi Ami, that 4 tfachim of a wall is significant. So now your entranceway is basically 4 tfachim long, right? So that's what he says. In order, how far do you have to dig? 4 tfachim into the mavoi, because that's all we care about. Once we go past that area, it's fine. Doesn't matter, unless obviously it's a huge pirta that's more than 10 amot. But up to 10 amot is fine, which means that 4 is what's important to us, 4 tfachim. That's sufficient. Additionally, they say, and this connects with the law of levud that we saw yesterday. Here's a practical application. V'im lav, let's say the pirza was more than 10, or you didn't have a 4 tfachim wall right nearby. Pachot mishlosha matil, shlosha eino matil. If the opening is less than 3 tfachim, meaning any break in the wall is less than 3 tfachim of a break, 3 handbreadths, then it's fine, because we say levud, you could have a number of different openings that are less than 3 tfachim each, and we still view that as a wall. But as soon as you have a pirza of more than 3 tfachim, that's going to be a pirza. Okay, that's not going to work. So basically, we're going to say, if, once you have, let's say you don't have the 4 tfachim wall in the front there, and you have a break of more than 3 tfachim, then it's no good. Okay, but that part's not significant for us right now, so we're going to leave that aside. So the Rav Yosef, Itle le Rabbi Ami, Labai lately to Rabbi Ami. We'll say that's the debate. Abai doesn't hold like Rabbi Ami. He doesn't think that a 4 tfachim wall is significant. He would have to say you'd have to have a wall that's 4 amot, because he thinks the entranceway to that mavoi has to be 4 amot long for you to be able to consider this a mavoi that we can use a lechi or a korah. And therefore, if the korah is lower than 10 tfachim off the ground, you're going to have to dig deep, right, for a length of 4 amot in order to say this mavoi is a 10 tfachim high mavoi. Amar lecha Abaye. So now they say not necessarily. You can't necessarily compare Rabbi Ami's case, where there was an opening, a breach in the wall, to our case of what makes something a mavoi. It says hatam sof mavoi, hachat chilat mavoi. There's a difference between something that was a mavoi, and now we want to say, well, is it no longer a mavoi? Or determining is this considered a halachic mavoi to begin with? So with tchilat mavoi, to say, is this a mavoi that we can use a lechi or a korah to matir it, if the height is less than 10 tfachim of this mavoi, and therefore you're going to put up a beam at a height of less than 10 tfachim, in order to consider it a mavoi that we can use a lechi or korah for, ika arba amot ini, low. If it has 4 amot, great. And if it doesn't, no way. It has to have 4 amot. But if it already was established as a mavoi, because it was bigger than, it already had 4 amot, and then there was a breach in the wall, then it's enough that we only have 4 tfachim in the beginning. That's fine, because we kind of view it as attached to the rest of the wall. That's a different thing. So therefore, we can't necessarily say that that's what their debate is, because it could be Abai agrees with Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi about when there's a breach in the wall. That's not the same as establishing from the beginning. Is it a mavoi? For that, you're going to need 4 amot, even though 4 tfachim might be okay for the other case. Now we're going to have 2 potential proofs where Abai is going to prove his approach. And then each time we're going to say, what does Rav Yosef do with that source? So the first one is going to be Amar Abaye, Amar Abaye Mina Aminala. Okay, we're about 15 lines from the bottom, maybe 14. Abaye says, Mina Aminala means, what's my source? Where do I get this from? Ditanya. So the first one is quoting a Tanaitic source. Later, the second one's going to be quoting an Amora. Ditanya. En mavoi nitar v'lechi v'korah ad shiu batim v'chatzerot ptuchim letocho. V'i ba'arba'a hechi mishkach ala. In order for something to be a mavoi, according to the Braita, it has to have, in order, well, you could call anything an alley, but in order for it to be an alley that we can put up a lechi or a korah and say, oh, now we can carry within this mavoi, it has to be a mavoi with the following criteria. It has to have houses open to courtyards and courtyards open to the mavoi. Now, what's an opening? An opening has to be minimally 4 tfachim. So now, he's going to say like this. If you say that courtyards have to open into the mavoi and each one has an opening of 4 tfachim, then the opening of the mavoi is only 4 tfachim. So let's imagine your entranceway. Imagine it's a square. There's a 4 by 4. 4 tfachim is the opening of the mavoi, and 4 tfachim, it goes into the mavoi. That's our whole thing about it being 4 tfachim. That's what Rabbi Yosef said. So now if you have, let's assume the chatzerot, okay, open on the sides. Okay, so you're facing into the mavoi, and from either side, there's a chatzer open. There's a picture of this also. So here's the picture. You have the entrance to the mavoi, and on either side, there's entrances from the chatzer. Now, if those are 4, and the entrance to the mavoi is 4, then you can't have the wall of the mavoi. There's no such thing as a wall of the mavoi. The mavoi has to have some sort of wall, otherwise the beam can't rest on the wall. So if it would basically cover all 4 tfachim, would have to be open if the exits to the courtyard go into the mavoi. So that can't basically work. So basically he says, that proves my point, that a mavoi can't be 4 by 4 tfachim. That will never work. You'll never end up you won't be able to have 2 chatzerot opening up into it, because each entrance from the chatzer is going to be 4. So therefore, that's his proof. So now they say, wait, maybe you could say where you open it b'dofen ha'emtzai. What does this mean? This means that the entrance to the mavoi is wider than it is long. Now, if you remember, I already told you this can't be, but they're suggesting. Okay, here's picture number 20, where basically the opening to the mavoi is wide. Let's just say it's 10 tfachim wide. And in that, while you're walking into the mavoi, you're facing 2 entrances, each 4 tfachim, let's say with a tefach in between each one and half a tefach on either side. And you basically are walking into those 2 entrances. Well, then you could have, because all we were talking now was how deep. We weren't necessarily saying it was 4 by 4. Maybe you could say it's 4 by 10. And then you'd have, all you have to go into the mavoi is 4 tfachim, that's Rav Yosef. And as long as it's 10 wide, you can have 2 entrances or 2 exits from 2 courtyards going into your mavoi. So if you want to say that, the obvious rejection is going to be what I said before, which is, Rav Nachman says, Naktinan, that means we have a tradition, the only type of mavoi that's permitted with a lechi or a korah is kol she'or ko yeter al rochbo. It has to be that the length is longer than the width. Now, why would this be? It makes sense, because again, if something's going to be noticeable, again, this fits in more with the heker. If something's going to be noticeable, if you have a very wide entrance, when you walk out, you're not going to notice the beam or the beam standing up or the beam going horizontally. You won't notice that at all. It has to be narrower so that as you're leaving the mavoi, you'll notice it. Once the entrance is so wide, there won't be any sort of noticeable reminder. So therefore, can't be that. So now comes the Pythagorean theorem to resolve our issue. He says, Rav Yosef, how will Rav Yosef understand this? Sorry, I skipped. Sorry, I didn't read the rest. Right? It both has to be longer, more than wide, and houses and courtyards have to open up into it. So Rav Yosef, what will he say? The entrance coming out of each of the courtyards, it could be a space of 4 by 4 exactly. How so? If the entrances from the courtyards are angled. If they're angled, and now it's very interesting, if you have a Gemara in front of you, the regular Gemara, there's pictures where Tosfot is, there's these pictures also by Rashi, there's pictures about a space of 4 by 4, and there's an angle coming off. Is it 3 by 1? Now, if you do the calculation, 3 by 1 with an angle coming is actually not 4. It's less than 4. It would have to be, and the Rashba says this, it would have to be 3 by 5 by 2. The angle would be, right, goes 3 by 5 one direction, 2 the other, and then you get to 4.25, and that would work. Okay, you can do the calculations on your own, but that's how it comes out. So it would have to be angled some way, and then you could have an entranceway of 4 by 4, like Rav Yosef says, that all you have to do is go in 4, and the courtyards could still exit the mavoi. Okay, and that would work, that they would still have their exit of 4 tefachim, and that works. So that was Abaya's first attempt at a proof. He said, since the chatzerot have to be open, it can't possibly be, it's only 4 tefachim. And then again, what it doesn't show is it could be 5, but again, he jumps up to the next level, to 4 amot. By the way, you can imagine, to me, this seems very logical, that part of the confusion of 4 tefachim or 4 amot was that maybe they had a tradition about 4, and they just didn't know, was it 4 amot or 4 cubits or 4 handbreadths. It's very likely that they got confused between this, and that caused some of the confusion. It's possible. Okay, now comes Abai and he brings a second proof. Amar Abai Menam Rami Bar Chama Amar Rav Huna, and for the rest of the daf, we're going to deal with this statement. We're going to basically first bring it as a proof and reject, explain Rav Yosef's side of how he reads this, and then we're going to go more in depth into this issue. So I see. So just before we move on, Adina wrote that in Hebrew, Arba'ah is Tfachim and Amod is Arba. So why would we confuse them? So first of all, we're going to see all around that lots of times it says Arba'ah and we're Arba, and it's corrected. There's a mistake. And lots of times the way they, first of all, in oral tradition, when they pass things down, could be people just got confused. They remember the number. They didn't necessarily remember how it was written. And if you go by how it was written, that doesn't help either, because often they would write Aleph Resh with a chupchik, and then just in abbreviation. They wrote abbreviated terms all the time, and that causes, just like Rabba and Rava are constantly confused, you can imagine that Arba'ah and Arba are always confused. So now Amar Rav Huna, Amar Rami Bar Chama, Amar Rav Huna. Lechi habolet midofno shel mavoy pachot me'arba amot nidon mishum lechi. Beino tzarich lechi acher lahatira. According to Rav Huna, which is passed down by Rami Bar Chama, if your wall, remember we said the mavoy we're assuming is open. Either it's open entirely or it's open partially, your fourth wall. What if it's open partially, meaning that the wall of the mavoy continues for a length of 4 cubits into that fourth side? So if you have a lechi that sticks out, okay, it's not a lechi, generally it means we took a beam and we stuck it there. In this case, it's a natural beam. It's not a beam that I brought over. It's a beam that was part of it was the wall itself. Can the wall function as a lechi? So he says like this: if it juts out less than 4 amot, then we can say that's a lechi. And you don't need any other lechi. That could be your noticeable reminder. So if wall number 4 juts out somewhat, less than 4 amot, we count that as a lechi. But dalit amot, once it juts out 4 amot, nidon mishum mavoy v'tzarich lechi acher latiro. That's considered part of the mavoy, and it's not considered a lechi, and therefore you need another lechi, okay, which we're going to get to exactly where would you put that lechi and how would that work. We'll get to that soon, but that's not important right now for our purposes. We want to bring this as proof for Abaye. How does Abaye prove this? It basically says, since it juts out 4, it becomes 4 amot, it becomes part of the mavoy. So Abaye takes this to mean, look what you have here. 4 amot designates mavoy. That's the size of a mavoy. It's not exactly clear cut, but that's what he says. So Rav Yosef is going to obviously say that's not really what it means. Rav Yosef la'afuki mitorat lechi adi ka'arba amot. Lemehave mavoy afilu ba'arba'at tvachim nami have mavoy. He says, when you want to say, is this no longer going to be considered a mavoy, and do we consider this a wall? Then you'll need a bigger measurement. You'll need 4 amot for it to basically say this doesn't count as a lechi. But to say what's the minimum measurement of a mavoy, that's something different. That's not what this source is. That's not what Rav Huna is talking about, and that 4 tvachim would be enough. So basically, is this connected or is it not? It's a good question. It's not so clear that the connection is so clear. Rav Yosef clearly said these things aren't connected, but Abaye thought they were. Now we're going to go into this statement. So now we're moving off of our topic. Again, we saw 2 machlokot of Rav Yosef and Abaye. Let me just review. So far, what we saw today is when you want to raise the floor or lower the beam to less than 20 amot, how far in your mavoy does it have to go? Either 1 tefach or 4 tefachim. Right? Rav Yosef always thinks the lesser amount. And when you want to dig down to make the beam or the height of the mavoy that's less than 10 handbreadths off the ground, and you want to dig down, how far into the mavoy do you need to go? Do you need to go 4 tefachim according to Rav Yosef or 4 amot according to Abaye? Now we're going to go into this statement. Gufa. Amar Rami Bar Chama, Amar Rav Huna, Lechi abolei midafno shel mavoy pachot me'arba amot nidon mishum lechi. Ve'ein tzarich lechi acher latiro. Again, this is just repeating. Gufa always means we're going to go in depth. It's kind of like a link in a website, right? Where you're reading something and then you want to go in depth. So here we go. Link into this. Rami Bar Chama says if you have this wall jutting out into your 4th wall of the mavoy, if it's less than 4 amot, we call that a lechi. You don't need to put another beam up. And you don't need ein sarich lechi acher latiro, but arba amot, once it's 4 cubits long, nidom mishum mavoi, it seems to be part of the wall of the mavoi, and therefore it's not a recognizable additional, it doesn't serve as a reminder, and therefore tzarich lechi acher latiro. Oto, so now the Gemara wants to know, that was just what we read before. Oto lechi hechan ma'amido. Where do you put that lechi? There's 2 options, basically. Either you attach it to that wall that's jutting out, or you put it on the opposite wall, right? The mavoi has an entranceway. One side of the entranceway is closed off by a wall, but at some point that wall ends. So do you put it at the end of that wall, or do you put it on the opposite wall where there's no wall to the mavoi at all, right? Just the wall that's from the third wall that's next to it. So again, you can see this in a picture. If you add it to that 4 amma wall, you're basically just making that wall, instead of 4 amot, it's now 4 amot and a tefach, or 4 amot. It just seems like a continuation of that wall and shouldn't really work. So Amar Papa Papa says very simply, put it on the other side. And that's the picture I showed you before, where you have, this is picture number 22, where you have this lechi habaleh. Maybe I didn't show you this before. You have the wall jutting out, and on the other side, you put up a lechi. Okay, that's the first option. But now we're going to have a second option, which has a bunch of options connected with it. Rav Huna bereid Rav Yoshua amar afilu tema demokele bahadeh. You could attach it to the wall. De mitzveh bei o de mivtzar bei. Okay, and Rashi explains this gives us a bunch of different possibilities. Okay, and here I'll show you the pictures. Either it goes taller, you can make it taller and then it'll be noticeable than the wall, or you can make it shorter than the wall, or you can make it perpendicular to the wall and just thicker. Okay, you can't really see this from the picture the way I'm showing you, but it would be basically you'd add a lechi that's wider than the wall and it stands perpendicular to it, so it juts out on both sides in that case, or it doesn't jut out at all and it's kind of implanted in the wall. Right, the same thing, almost perpendicular. It's not exactly perpendicular. It's just added to the wall, but it's narrower than the thickness of the wall. And in all those cases, it will be noticeable. So those are all possible options. Okay, so those are ways that they suggest doing it. Now comes Rav Huna. Rav Huna Bereid Rav Yoshua says something else. I want you to not confuse the people. The first statement we have is Rami Bar Chama in the name of Rav Huna. That's one Rav Huna, and now we're in a different Rav Huna. This is Rav Huna Bereid Rav Yoshua. So the first statement was Rami Bar Chama in the name of Rav Huna, that if you have this lechi sticking out, if it goes 4 amot long, you need a different lechi to fix it. Then we had 2 explanations of where you put the lechi. Rav Papa said on the opposite side. Rav Huna Bereid Rav Yoshua said you can put it on the same side. It just has to be noticeable in some kind of way. Amar Rav Huna Bereid Rav Yoshua. Now he says something else about the statement of the first Rav Huna. Lo amaran, this whole thing was only said, ela b'mavoi shmona. Aval b'mavoi shiv'ah, he says like this: if the mavoi is 8 wide, and then you have this 4 amma wall, then you're going to need another lechi. But if it's only 7 wide, and here you see that they weren't so correct and careful with their mathematics, just like we saw before about the 3 and the 1, which doesn't really make an angle that's 4. They were kind of, their way of doing mathematics was, I would say, more an estimation, okay, rough estimates. So here they say it really is anything less than 8, okay, because anything less than 8, right, they say 7, because 7 is less than 8, but it could be anything less than 8. You would have a situation where the wall covers the majority of the space, right? If it's 7.8, let's say, so 4 amot is more than 3.8. So therefore, then, based on laws of chatzer, we're going to make a kavachomer from a chatzer. A chatzer is something that's walled in. Now, if the chatzer is walled in with an entranceway, right, that's what we saw before, an open way of 4 tefachim. But a chatzer, we're going to read now, ma chatzer she'ena niteret be'lechi v'korah. A lechi or korah doesn't help you. If you have a chatzer all open on one side, you can't put up a lechi or korah like you can in a mavoi. You have to have the wall closed with a bit of an opening. That will work, but not if it has the whole side is open. So a chatzer is not niteret lechi v'korah, which means that laws of a courtyard are more stringent than laws of mavoi, because laws of mavoi, you can fix it with a lechi or a korah. And yet, when it comes to a wall, what did I say? If your wall is broken or you don't have a wall in a chatzer, it's a problem. However, niteret be'omei merubah laparutz. As long as you have the majority of the wall standing in the, right, but the minority is broken, that wall still functions as a wall. So if that works in a case where we don't allow a lechi and a korah, it must work all the more so in a mavoi where we allow a lechi and a korah. So eino din shenitar ba'omei merubah laparutz, which means that in this case, you wouldn't even need a lechi. It's the whole issue here that once it's 4 amot, you're going to need a lechi. To fix it, that's only if it's less than 8 amot, the whole thing. But if it's more than 8 amot, if it's less than 8 amot, then it's as if there's a wall. You don't even need a lechi or a korah. It's just like the laws of courtyards, where we basically say, Homei merubah laparutz is fine. If there's more standing than breached, we're going to come across this term a lot in Eruvin about all sorts of breaches in walls, okay? So if more is standing than open, then it's fine. So then they say, wait a minute. You want to say that chatzer is more stringent than mavoi, but that's not necessarily true because there's a leniency in mavoi that doesn't apply, in chatzer, courtyard, that doesn't apply in an alley. Ma lechatzer shekem pirtzata be'eser, tomar b'mavoi shepirtzato ba'arba'ah. When you have a breach in a wall in a chatzer, it has to be 10 for it to be 10 amot for it to be considered significant. But when it comes to a breach in a mavoi, 4 tfachim is already problematic. So what do you see here? Clearly, mavoi is more stringent. So you can't necessarily make a kal v'chomer because mavoi has its own stringency. This is always how you knock out a kal v'chomer. You say there's a stringency by this that doesn't exist in the other case. Okay, I just want to check one thing because there was a difference in girsa. I just want to see one thing. Yeah, there's a debate here whether it's arba. This is a good case. I thought this was it, where Adina's question about don't they know the difference between 4 and 4? So here there's a debate whether the girsa is supposed to be 4 tfachim or 4 amot. It's not so clear. Okay, so there's different opinions about what it's supposed to be. So what did they say? When Rav Huna Bered Rav Yeshua made this kal v'chomer, it's because he doesn't agree with that thing about the 4. Kasava Rav Huna Bered Rav Yeshua mavoi nami pirtzato be'eser. He thinks that a mavoi is the same as a chatzer in terms of a breach in the mavoi would only be significant if it's 10 amot. So then they say, wait a minute. Okay, and this is why I mentioned it before. We started with Rav Huna, and then we had this statement, again, just to review. Rav Huna said, if it's more than 4 amot, then you need a lechi. Came Rav Huna Bered Rav Yeshua and said that's only if the wall itself is 8. If the wall is less than 8, then omei merubah laparutz, which we learn kal v'chomer from chatzer. Now you'd have to assume, in order, he's describing Rav Huna's statement. He's narrowing its focus. So now they say, well, if you want to say that he can hold this kal v'chomer because he thinks a pirtzah is 10 also for a mavoi and not 4, which means mavoi doesn't have a chumrah. Well, that makes no sense because why? Leman ka'amrinan, who was he referring to? Rav Huna Bered Rav Yeshua. He was referring to Rav Huna's statement. And le Rav Huna, v'ha Rav Huna pirtzato ba'arba'ah sfirale. And we know from a different place that Rav Huna, the first one, holds the pirtza and a mavoi, a breach in the mavoi to be considered significant is 4 tvachim. So basically, we're going to say he's going to hold then, there is no kal v'chomer because mavoi has its own chumrah over chatzer. So what did they answer? Rav Huna Bered Rav Yeshua Tama Dinafshe Kamar. He was building off of Rav Huna's statement, but he was going according to his own opinion. He doesn't have to match up with Rav Huna all the way. He took Rav Huna's statement and took it one step further through his own lens, through his, the way he was reading things with his glasses on, not with Rav Huna's glasses. Okay, Rav Huna himself wouldn't agree with this. He wouldn't be able to make that kal v'chomer because he thinks mavoi has a chumrah, that mavoi is pirtza is 4 and chatzer is 10. And therefore, he wouldn't be able to. But Rav Huna Bered Rav Yeshua is taking Rav Huna and taking it according to his opinion, saying that no, mavoi is 10, just like chatzer, in which case chatzer has the bigger chumrah because it's not nitar belechi or korah, and therefore we can learn from there to mavoi. Okay, and now, so that's the first statement. So Rav Huna Bered Rav Yeshua was trying to say that either once it's 4 amot, it can't function as a lechi, but there could be a scenario where you wouldn't even need a lechi because Omed merubah laparutz that we can learn from chatzer. Rav Ashi Amar afilu tema b'mavoi shmone nami lo tzarich lechi. He goes even farther. He says if the mavoi is 8, he says not more than 8, but let's say it's 8 exactly. Says at 8 exactly, you also don't need a lechi. Why don't you need a lechi? He says like this, and this is all based on exactly what I said before. All of the things they did were estimates. They didn't have tape measures and certainly not computers that measure everything precisely. They did everything by estimates. So therefore, he says like this, if you have a wall that's 4 and it's in a space of 8, we're going to assume that you're not exacting in your measurements. And therefore, we're going to go like this. Manafshach. Either way you look at it, it's going to work. I omed nafish, if the 4 part is bigger, let's say it's not really 8, it's really 7.9. So if the omed and it's really 4 amo, if that's more, nitar b'omed murubala parutz, just like Rav Huna Rav Yoshua just said. I paritz nafish, if it's really, let's say, a little less than 4, and it's exactly 8, so you have parutz merubah, well then it's less than 4. If it's less than 4, what did we say in the beginning? If it's less than 4, it functions like a lechi, nidom mishum lechi. And then what if, the only other possibility we didn't say is, what if it's exactly 4 and exactly 8? So he says, Maya Mark, what you think if they're exactly identical, you're going to worry? The suffix divrehen makil. You're never going to be able to get the exact measurement. And therefore, you're never going to really know. So it's a suffix, it's a doubt case. Once we have a doubt, well, this is all laws of the rabbis anyway. And when it comes to doubts and rabbinical laws, we're always makil, we're lenient. And therefore, even if it's exact, it probably isn't exactly exact. And therefore, we're going to go lenient. And therefore, he says, even if it's exactly 8, you're going to be okay also. Okay, and then you don't need any lechi. Okay, with that, we'll finish for today and start up tomorrow or for Shabbat's daf on the bottom of this stuff, the last line, the last 2 lines of the daf. Shabbat shalom, everybody.